While the whole department is focused on research that has an impact and very interested in the possibilities of taking their research out into the wider public, we chose two case studies that offered completely different historical periods but also audiences for that impact. The first one was Will Rossiter, who works on the Renaissance, and in particular, in this case, it was Shakespeare, and he took his research into the local communities in relationship with A-level and GCSE students and how they are beginning to learn Shakespeare and ask questions about the morality of Shakespeare and where moral goodness might lie in our appreciation of Shakespeare's texts. So Will gave a series of lectures and workshops and also follow-up sessions at the schools themselves. And one way that we could assess the impact was through feedback forms. So the students were asked to fill in forms talking about how his lectures had changed their understanding of Shakespeare, but also how their own thoughts about Shakespeare have been developing during the course of their studies. The students were very positive about the experience, but also it was clear from the feedback that they were asking questions about Shakespeare and morality and what it might mean to say that Shakespeare is good for us. And that they're no longer just simply looking at Shakespeare as something they have to do as a text in class, but actually something that might have a bigger impact upon them as people and on society as a whole. In his follow-up sessions too, because they took place sometime after the original workshops and lectures, Will was able therefore to assess whether the students were having a different relationship with Shakespeare, so to speak, and also that the teachers themselves were part of this project so that they themselves could comment on how the students had changed in their work on Shakespeare, and also how the teachers themselves found teaching Shakespeare in relationship to morality. Were the teachers themselves teaching it because they felt it was going to make the students better people, or that Shakespeare's good for us, or were they teaching it purely in terms of subject matter or style and so forth? Dr. Zoe Kinsley in our department works on women's travel writing of the 18th century, and so therefore it was very interesting to see how and in what way she might be able to have an impact with her research, particularly since she works on a writer who, in contrast to Will Rossiter's research, is a writer who is essentially unknown to most members of the public. So whereas Will was taking Shakespeare, the most famous of writers, Zoe was concentrating in particular on Dorothy Richardson, not the 20th century Dorothy Richardson, but a lesser known writer from the 18th century. And it was amazing to see how she managed to get the public interested in that writer, partly through the fact that it's a female writer, and that here we were seeing a female voice from the 18th century, a fairly forgotten voice, but also women's writers from the 18th century might be neglected in relation in comparison with the men. One example of that was Scarborough, where Zoe does a lot of work and where she worked closely with local museums and archives and with the local fishing communities as well, where taking Dorothy Richardson's descriptions of fishing communities in the 18th century, they could then comment on how similar or different their own experiences have been in the last few decades. And it was going to be a case where virtually everyone in the room had never heard of this writer and were coming to it completely afresh with no particular opinions either way, but she had a wonderful impact upon them. She also took her work to writing festivals and so on, where there was a more kind of consciously literary audience perhaps, where again there was a lot of interest because of Dorothy Richardson having not only a female perspective, but also taking an interest in rather more industrial aspects of the north of England as well. Of particular interest in this case study is the impact that Zoe had on local communities, helping local people to think about the history of the areas in which they live across the north of England, whether it be Scarborough on the east coast or in the northwest in more industrial areas around Manchester and Wigan, and allowing people to engage with their own communities through a writer they'd not heard of and through literary history and heritage. It was wonderful to see people's engagement with that and their pride in the area in which they live.